Today is July the 20th. Why was David a good king? Let's find out together as we read Psalm 78. Reading through Book 3 of Psalms, we come to Psalm 78, a long psalm. It consists of 72 verses. It is still a psalm of Asaph, written apparently after David had become king. And we'll find out why we know that when we come to the end of the psalm. So in the psalm, the Lord starts by saying, "Let me speak to you in a parable." But he doesn't use a parable in the same way that Jesus used parables. Instead, he talks about Israel's history. And he mentions in Israel's history two elements: the faithfulness of God and the unfaithfulness of Israel. First of all, he mentions the faithfulness of God. Look what he says in verses 13. He says he divided the sea and he led Israel through, making the waters stand up like walls. In the daytime, he led them like a cloud. At night, by a pillar of fire. He split open rocks in the wilderness to give them water as from a gushing spring. God was with Israel as they left Egypt. In verse 24, he rained down manna for them to eat. He gave them bread from heaven. And as if that wasn't enough, in verse 27, he rained down meat as thick as dust, birds as plentiful as the sand on the seashore. He not only provided them with food, he also protected them. Verses 42 and 43, they didn't remember his power, how he rescued them from their enemies. They didn't remember his miraculous signs in Egypt, his wonders on the plain of Zoan. He turned their river to blood. And he goes on and he talks about some of the plagues of Egypt that we see there. But in spite of God's faithfulness, Israel was unfaithful. Verse 10, they didn't keep God's covenant. They refused to live by his instructions. Verses 17 and 18, they kept on sinning against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They stubbornly tested God in their hearts, demanding the foods that they craved. Verse 32, in spite of this, the people kept sinning. Despite his wonders, they refused to trust him. Verses 40 and 41, oh, how often they rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved his heart in that dry wasteland. Again and again, they tested God's patience and provoked the Holy One of Israel. Verse 56, they kept testing and rebelling against God Most High. They did not obey his laws. Now, Asaph kind of summarizes what he's saying in the middle of this section, verses 37 and 38. Their hearts were not loyal to God. They didn't keep his covenant. And yet God was merciful and forgave their sins and didn't destroy them all. In spite of Israel's unfaithfulness, God stayed faithful. And so, we come to the end of this psalm. Verse 67, the Lord says, as a result of all of this, God rejected Joseph's descendants. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim. Now, if you remember, Ephraim is one of Joseph's sons. Joseph was Judah's selection as firstborn. But when it came time, God skipped over Reuben and selected Judah to be prominent among all of the tribes of Israel. Verse 68, but God chose instead the tribe of Judah and Mount Zion, which he loved. There he built a sanctuary as high as the heavens, as solid and enduring as the earth. He chose his servant David, calling him from the sheep pens. He took David from tending the ewes and lambs and made him the shepherd of Jacob's descendants, God's own people, Israel. Now, why did he do that? Why did he pick David? Verse 72. David cared for them with a true heart. He led them with skillful hands. We see three things about David in these short verses. One, God chose him. That's where it started. 3, he had skill in leading. He was a skillful warrior. He was a skillful king. But 2, right in the middle, he cared for them with a true heart. David made a lot of mistakes. The book of 2 Samuel tells us about all of the mistakes that David made. And there were a lot. He actually ended up dividing the kingdom or setting the stage for a divided kingdom. By the end of his reign, the historian who wrote 2 Kings called Israel Judah and Israel. He recognized the divide that was already there. David made a lot of mistakes, but he had a true heart. How's your heart today? Is it true? Get it right with God, and you'll be amazed at what you can do. Like, follow, and subscribe to this devotional on whatever platform you use to listen to it. Tomorrow, we'll answer the question, why was Stephen martyred?